A 97-year-old woman is selling her house, and the agents can't believe what they find inside. Subscribe, watch until the end, and write in the comments where you are watching us from. In the heart of an old neighborhood in Atlanta, tucked between newly built glass-fronted homes and manicured lawns, stood a small weathered house that looked like it belonged to another century. Its wooden siding was pale and peeling, its porch sagged slightly at one end, and a crooked fence leaned outward as though too tired to stand any longer. Across the street, freshly painted modern homes with pristine gardens gleamed under the sun, but this little house sat quietly, stubbornly holding its place in a world that had long moved on. It was the home of May Ellison, a 97-year-old woman who had lived there since she was 24. May woke every morning at dawn, as she had for decades. Her routine had not changed. She shuffled from her bedroom, her slippers brushing softly against the creaking hardwood floors, and moved to the kitchen where she brewed coffee in the same old copper pot her husband had once used before he passed. The smell filled the small house, mingling with the faint scent of polished wood and dried lavender that clung to the curtains. She poured herself a cup and sat by the window in her favorite chair, the sunlight streaming through lace curtains and casting delicate patterns on her wrinkled hands. From her seat, she could see the street, the neighbors walking their dogs, delivery trucks passing, children on their way to school. She heard their voices sometimes, muffled but sharp enough to catch words. "That old house is such an eyesore," one woman said to another as they jogged past. "I can't believe it's still standing. It's like something out of a ghost story." May sipped her coffee and didn't respond. She had grown used to those comments, just as she had grown used to the way children would glance nervously at her house and then giggle, daring each other to run up and touch the fence before sprinting away in shrieks of laughter. They called it the witch's house, as if her quiet presence made her something mythical, something to mock from a safe distance. She had seen this neighborhood change in ways those children could not imagine. Once, the street had been filled with families like hers, black families who had fought to own a piece of land and build their lives in a city that had not always wanted them. The houses had been modest but alive with laughter, with Sunday barbecues and front porch conversations that stretched long into the summer evenings. Now, those houses were gone, replaced by towering new constructions with polished chrome doors and tinted windows that reflected the sunlight too brightly to look at directly. The old friends were gone too. Some moved away, many buried. May's house was the last of its kind on this street, a stubborn reminder of a time most preferred to forget. Inside, though, the house was nothing like its weathered exterior suggested. The floors were polished to a shine. Rugs with intricate patterns softened the steps in the hallway. The walls were lined with photographs, each frame holding a piece of her life. Her wedding day in 1947, her husband Robert standing proudly in his Army uniform, her two children when they were still small enough to fit in her lap. There were photos of Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor, birthday parties in the backyard beneath the shade of the great oak tree that still stood there, and black and white images from marches and rallies during the Civil Rights Movement. Robert standing in the crowd, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. May's favorite room was the library, though calling it a library was grander than it truly was. It was a narrow room with shelves that Robert had built himself, lined from floor to ceiling with books. Some were worn and faded, spines cracked from use, while others were carefully wrapped in brown paper to protect them. There were old history texts, collections of poetry, and even a few volumes signed by authors they had met in their younger days. Among the books were boxes of newspapers, yellowed with age, carrying headlines from times that had once felt urgent and alive. March in Selma, King speaks in Atlanta, Civil Rights Act passed. May liked to sit there in the evenings, her hand resting on the arm of Robert's old leather chair, breathing in the faint smell of paper and memory. Outside, however, the world didn't see any of that. They saw chipped paint and a rusty mailbox. They saw an old black woman they didn't know, one who moved slowly and spoke softly and assumed neglect. Children whispered stories about her as though she were a character in one of their games, laughing about how she must live surrounded by cobwebs and dust. May overheard them sometimes when she tended to her roses in the front yard. "My dad says that house should be torn down," a boy once shouted as he ran past with his friends, the words carried clearly in the still afternoon air. "He says it's dangerous to live in something that old." His friends laughed, and May straightened slowly, holding her watering can. She thought of correcting them, of inviting them inside to see how wrong they were, but instead she smiled faintly to herself and went back to her flowers. What did it matter what they thought? This house wasn't just walls and wood, it was her life. Every board had been nailed down by Robert's hands, every room filled with echoes of their laughter, their arguments, their love. The old oak in the yard still held the tire swing he had hung for their son, though it hadn't been used in decades. The kitchen still held the dent in the wall from when her daughter had thrown a ball indoors, breaking her father's "no sports in the house" rule. Yet she couldn't ignore the weight of time forever. Each step up the stairs left her knees aching. Carrying laundry from the washer to the clothesline left her winded. She still scrubbed the floors on her hands and knees every Saturday, but it took her twice as long as it used to. The world outside whispered that she was too old for this house, and though she resented it, a small, quiet part of her wondered if they might be right. That evening, May sat in her rocking chair by the window, watching the lights flicker on in the newer homes across the street. Their windows glowed brightly, their porches lined with sleek outdoor furniture and potted plants that looked as if they'd been arranged by a designer. She listened to laughter drift across the yard, young couples entertaining friends, music playing faintly from hidden speakers. Her own house was silent, save for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. She reached for the small framed photograph of Robert that always sat on the side table. His smile was the same one she remembered, warm and sure, his eyes kind and strong. "It's just me now, Robert," she whispered. The sound of her own voice startled her in the quiet. She looked around the room, her gaze settling on the shelves, the furniture, the faded curtains that she had sewn herself 40 years ago. She wondered how much longer she could keep it all just as it was, how much longer she could hold on to it without help. Outside, a group of teenagers walked by, their laughter loud and sharp in the night air. One of them pointed toward her house. "Looks haunted," he said, and they all burst into laughter. May sighed softly and set the photograph back on the table. She closed her eyes and leaned back, letting the familiar creak of her chair fill the silence. She had heard it all before. The jokes, the whispers, the sideways glances from passers-by who couldn't imagine that an old house could be anything but a ruin. But she knew the truth. Inside these walls, she had lived a life full of love and struggle, of laughter and tears, of history both personal and shared. Every nail, every beam, every polished floorboard held a story. And though the world outside might see only an old woman in a decaying house, May Ellison knew she was guarding something precious, something irreplaceable, a piece of herself that she wasn't yet ready to let go of. The night after May had sat in her chair holding Robert's photograph, she found herself waking earlier than usual, long before the first trace of light crept across the sky. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen and the slow, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. May lay there in the darkness, her mind turning over memories and possibilities like cards shuffled in a restless hand. She could still hear the laughter from outside her window the night before, still hear the voices of strangers mocking what they could not understand. It was not their laughter that unsettled her most. It was the way their words echoed a thought she had been trying to push aside for months. Her knees ached as she swung her legs out of bed and stood, steadying herself with the edge of the dresser. It was not new pain. It had been creeping into her bones for years, but lately it seemed sharper, more insistent. The walk down the hallway felt longer than it once had. The stairs to the basement, where the laundry was, loomed like a small mountain. Even carrying a basket of clothes had begun to feel like an ordeal. There had been a time, she thought, when she could scrub those floors on her hands and knees and then walk to the market without a second thought. Now, even rising from her chair after a long evening seemed to take all the strength she had. She boiled water for her coffee, holding onto the edge of the counter for balance. As she waited for the pot to heat, she looked around the kitchen. The room was bright and cheerful, just as she had always kept it, the curtains neatly pressed, the linoleum floor spotless despite its faded pattern. Yet there was no denying that age had worn its mark on the place. The faucet dripped faintly, and though she had tightened it more than once, it always found a way to start again. The cabinets that Robert had installed himself decades ago still stood firm, but their paint was chipped around the handles. Little things, nothing she could not fix, but they added up. She sat at the small kitchen table, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, and stared at the wall where Robert's photograph hung beside the calendar. His smile felt almost alive in that early hour, as if he were sitting across from her the way he used to, reading the morning paper. How many mornings had they shared in this very room? She closed her eyes and could almost hear his voice, could almost smell the faint scent of aftershave he wore. Those mornings were gone now, but the house held them close, as if it, too, remembered. That was the part that hurt most, knowing that if she left this place, she would be leaving behind more than walls and windows. But she couldn't ignore what her body told her. The simple tasks that once filled her day now drained her strength. She had fallen once, a year ago, reaching too high for a box on a shelf in the hallway closet. She hadn't told her daughter about it, not wanting to worry her, but she remembered lying there on the floor for several minutes, stunned and breathless, before she managed to pull herself upright. That memory haunted her now as she looked around her quiet kitchen. If it happened again, what then? Later that morning, she called her daughter Evelyn, who lived 2 states away in North Carolina. Evelyn answered quickly, her voice warm but tinged with worry, the way it always was when May phoned unexpectedly. "Mornin', Mama," Evelyn said. "You're up early. Everything all right?" May hesitated for a moment before answering. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about this house, about me still being here, all alone." On the other end of the line there was a pause. May could almost picture Evelyn sitting at her own kitchen table with a mug of coffee, her brow furrowed in concern. "Mama," she said gently, "you know I've been saying for a while now, you don't have to do this by yourself anymore. There are places where they take good care of you, places where you'd be safe." "I know," May replied. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I know you've been saying that. And maybe it's time I listen." They talked for a long while after that, Evelyn's words soft and reassuring. She spoke of a retirement community near her home, one where May would have her own space but wouldn't be alone. There would be nurses if she needed help, and neighbors her own age to talk to. May listened, nodding even though her daughter couldn't see her. When the call ended, May stayed seated at the table, staring at the phone. She had known this conversation was coming for a long time. The truth was, she'd been preparing herself for it in small ways, sorting through drawers, throwing out old papers, boxing up things she hadn't used in years. Yet, now that the decision was here, it felt heavier than she imagined. She rose from the table and wandered through the house slowly, touching the familiar things she passed as if memorizing them. The banister, worn smooth beneath her hand, the framed quilt her mother had sewn, the dent in the door frame where her son had once run his toy truck too hard against it. By late afternoon, the news had already started to spread. May overheard it when she stepped onto the porch to water her roses. Two of the women from across the street were walking by, their conversation unguarded. "She's really selling it?" one asked, her voice incredulous. "About time, honestly. That place has been falling apart for years." The other laughed. "I heard someone wants to buy the lot and tear it down. Can you imagine what they could build there? It'd finally match the rest of the neighborhood." May turned her head slightly, pretending not to hear. She focused on her roses instead, snipping away a dried bloom and inhaling the sweet scent of the others that still flourished despite her inconsistent care. She loved those flowers. Robert had planted them for her on their 15th anniversary. Even now, decades later, they bloomed every summer as if they remembered him too. That evening, she made her way into the library and sat down in Robert's old chair. The leather creaked under her weight, familiar and comforting. She gazed at the shelves of books, at the boxes of newspapers and photographs, at the tangible pieces of her life stacked neatly around her. Selling this house meant deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. It meant letting go not just of objects, but of moments, of history, of the invisible threads that tied her to this place. Yet she knew what had to be done. She couldn't stay here forever. She whispered the words into the stillness of the room, testing them as though saying them aloud might make them more real. It's time. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the street in shades of gold. Through the window, May could see her neighbors chatting in their driveways, the gleam of new cars parked along the curb. Children rode their bikes in small circles, their laughter rising into the warm evening air. Someone across the street turned on music, soft, cheerful, modern, and it drifted faintly toward her porch. It was a neighborhood that had changed around her, reshaped itself until her house looked out of place among the sleek new constructions. She was the last remnant of what it had once been. As night fell, May walked from room to room, her steps slow but steady, her fingers trailing over every surface. In the kitchen, she straightened a row of ceramic jars. In the dining room, she ran her hand across the polished wood of the table where countless meals had been shared. Upstairs, she paused in each bedroom, lingering longest in the one that had once belonged to her children. The walls were bare now, but she could still see it in her mind as it used to be. Stuffed animals on the bed, drawings taped to the walls, laughter spilling out into the hallway. When she finally returned to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. Tomorrow, she would call an agent. Tomorrow, the process would begin. The thought was both frightening and oddly freeing. She had held on to this house for so long, but perhaps it was time to let it go, not because it had lost its value, but because she wanted its story to outlast her. She lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin, and stared at the ceiling in the dark. The clock ticked in the hallway. The house, her faithful companion for more than 70 years, seemed to sigh around her, the wood settling as it always had at night. May closed her eyes and whispered softly into the dark, "Robert, I think I'm ready." The morning after May had resolved to sell her house, she awoke with a sense of quiet determination that felt strange and heavy in her chest. The decision was no longer just an idea she could push aside. It was real now, tangible. After breakfast, she sat at the small kitchen table with her telephone and a piece of paper where she had written down a few names of local real estate agents. She hesitated for a long moment, staring at the list. The voices of her neighbors from the day before still echoed in her ears. That place has been falling apart for years. Yet, even as their words lingered, she tightened her grip on the phone and began dialing. It took several calls before she found someone willing to come see the house without hesitation. One agent had politely declined, saying their firm was focused on more modern properties. Another said they were fully booked, but May could hear the doubt in their voice. When she reached Candace Young, however, the woman sounded bright and energetic, eager to take on a challenge. May had no way of knowing that Candace, sitting in her spotless office surrounded by glossy photos of luxury homes, already imagined her house as a worn-out relic, a project that would test her patience and probably amount to nothing more than an overgrown lot to be cleared for redevelopment. Candace arrived 3 days later. May had spent those days preparing in her quiet, meticulous way, dusting every shelf, polishing the floors until they gleamed, opening windows to let the fresh air flow through rooms heavy with memory. It wasn't that the house was dirty, it never was, but she wanted it to look its very best, not for the agent or any buyers, but for herself, as if honoring it before she handed it over. When Candace's sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway, May was already waiting on the porch, leaning gently on the railing. She watched as the young woman stepped out of her car, dressed in a crisp blazer and heels that clicked sharply against the walkway. Candace's eyes flickered up toward the roof, then down to the chipped paint on the siding, and May saw the faintest shadow of skepticism pass across her face. "Mrs. Ellison," Candace called with a practiced smile. "That's me," May replied warmly. Her voice carried the kind of calm steadiness that made Candace's brisk energy seem almost out of place in comparison. They exchanged pleasantries, but May noticed how Candace's gaze darted around the exterior, lingering on the sagging porch step, the rusted mailbox, the ivy creeping up the fence. Across the street, two neighbors stood on their driveway, pretending to talk while clearly watching, their faces curious and faintly amused. May heard one of them murmur something to the other and saw the quick smirk they shared. She felt a familiar sting, but ignored it, focusing instead on Candace's polite but hurried questions about the age of the house, the square footage, and whether there were any structural issues she should be aware of. May led her to the door, her hand steady on the old brass handle polished smooth by decades of use. "You'll see for yourself," she said, and pushed it open. Candace stepped inside and stopped dead. For a moment, she didn't speak. May watched her eyes widen slightly, the way her shoulders straightened as if she had expected to step into shadows and cobwebs, but instead found herself in a warm glow of polished wood and sunlight streaming through lace curtains. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and lavender, clean and comforting, not musty as she had anticipated. The entryway opened into the living room where a soft rug in muted tones lay perfectly centered beneath an old but pristine sofa, its cushions plump and inviting. Photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, a younger May in her wedding dress standing beside Robert in his uniform, the two of them holding their children, gatherings of smiling family members over the years. "This," Candace began, her voice trailing off as she glanced around. "This is beautiful." May gave a small, knowing smile. "Looks different inside, doesn't it?" Candace nodded mutely, stepping further in. The living room led to a dining area with a polished oak table that gleamed as though it had just been varnished. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, and its prisms catching the afternoon sun. From there, May guided her toward the kitchen. The cabinets were painted a soft mint green, perfectly maintained, with polished chrome handles. The counters, though old-fashioned, were spotless. On the windowsill above the sink, small pots of herbs grew in neat rows, filling the air with the subtle scent of rosemary and thyme. Candace ran her hand lightly over the counter and glanced toward May. "How old is this kitchen?" May chuckled. "Robert redid it himself back in 1958. I've kept it the same since." Each room they entered seemed to deepen Candace's surprise. The library was next, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves full of neatly organized volumes and boxes of old newspapers labeled in Robert's careful handwriting. Sunlight filtered through gauzy curtains, pooling across the worn leather chair that still bore the faint impression of its longtime occupant. In the hallway, the floors shone with a mirror-like sheen. The bedrooms upstairs were simple but immaculate, each with its own character. Floral wallpaper in one, pale blue in another, quilts folded neatly at the foot of each bed. The bathroom tiles, though vintage, looked as if they had been scrubbed daily for half a century. By the time they descended into the basement, Candace's initial skepticism had melted entirely. She gasped softly at the sight of the finished space. Paneled wood walls, a retro bar with glass shelves lined with polished decanters, and framed posters from jazz concerts in the 1970s. It felt less like a basement, and more like stepping back in time to a vibrant, living past. "I don't understand," Candace admitted, almost laughing in disbelief. "From the outside, I never would have guessed. This is like walking through history." May nodded, resting her hand lightly against the wall. "It's been my history," she said simply. 73 years in this house. Robert and I built a life here, raised our children here. Every nail, every board, he touched them all." Candace turned in a slow circle, absorbing it all. Outside, faint laughter drifted through the windows, neighbors on their porches, watching, no doubt speculating about what was happening inside the eyesore of the street. If they could see what Candace was seeing now, May thought, their smirks might fade. By the time the tour ended and they returned to the living room, Candace's demeanor had shifted entirely. Her polished professionalism softened into something more personal, almost reverent. She asked careful questions about the home's maintenance, clearly impressed when May explained how she had kept everything in pristine condition, even as the years passed. Standing by the window, Candace glanced outside again. She saw the modern homes lined up neatly across the street, gleaming in their sameness, and then turned back toward May's living room, rich with color and life. "Mrs. Ellison," she said finally, "this isn't just a house, it's a treasure." May smiled faintly at that. She had known it all along, but hearing someone else say it filled her with a quiet pride that eased some of the ache she had been carrying. As Candace left that afternoon, promising to handle everything personally, May stood on the porch and watched her drive away. The neighbors across the street were still there, still talking in low voices. One of them glanced toward May and quickly looked away as if embarrassed to be caught staring. May didn't mind. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, a sense that perhaps the world outside would finally see what she had always known. Her house was not a ruin. It was a legacy. The week following Candace's visit passed quickly, filled with a flurry of preparations that May had not experienced in decades. Candace called often, her tone brisk and businesslike, but with an undercurrent of genuine enthusiasm that May could hear even over the phone. The listing photos had been taken, showing each carefully curated room in golden light, the polished wood floors gleaming, the old oak table in the dining room arranged with a vase of fresh roses, and the retro basement bar staged like a scene from a magazine spread. May had been surprised to see how beautiful her house looked through the lens of Candace's photographer, though she had always known its worth. Now, it seemed, the rest of the world might finally see it too. The first open house was scheduled for Saturday afternoon. May spent the morning polishing surfaces that already gleamed, smoothing quilt edges that needed no straightening, and setting fresh flowers in nearly every room. The scent of them mingled with the clean fragrance of lemon oil and the faint, nostalgic smell of old paper in the library. She wanted it to be perfect, not because she doubted its appeal, but because this was her way of honoring it, of saying goodbye slowly, in her own deliberate fashion. Candace arrived early, dressed in another sharp suit, carrying a folder of printed brochures that displayed photographs of the house in bold, glossy color. She was upbeat, assuring May that there had already been considerable interest. "We'll have a good turnout," she said, placing the brochures neatly on the entryway table. "I can feel it." May, standing beside her in a simple lavender dress and soft slippers, nodded politely, but felt a knot in her stomach. She could see movement outside through the lace curtains, neighbors lingering on porches, leaning subtly against fences, their eyes fixed on her home. For years they had whispered about it, dismissing it as outdated or decrepit. Now they seemed eager to see what kind of spectacle this would become. The first visitors arrived not long after. May stayed back in the kitchen while Candace greeted them, but she could hear every word clearly. A young couple stepped in, their sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. "It's nice," the woman said at first, her voice measured. Then, after a pause, she added, "But it feels like my grandmother's house." Her partner chuckled. "Yeah, it's cute. But look at those curtains. And the wallpaper in the hall. Oh man, it's like a time capsule." May, standing just out of sight, felt her lips tighten. She had chosen that wallpaper herself decades ago in a shop that had long since closed, and Robert had put it up for her on a warm Saturday afternoon. To them, it was just old paper. To her, it was a memory pressed flat against the wall. More people came, filling the house with a low murmur of voices and the occasional burst of laughter. Some admired the craftsmanship, the solid wood cabinets, the carved details on the staircase banister, the retro bar in the basement. But others spoke with an offhand carelessness that stung. "This place needs a total gut," one man declared loudly enough for May to hear from the dining room. "I mean, it's charming in that old lady way, but come on, new floors, new paint, maybe knock out a wall or two, start fresh." Another group wandered into the library where May stood quietly in a corner, her hands clasped together. A woman in her 30s glanced around at the shelves of books and stacks of newspapers and said with a laugh, "What is all this? She could open a history museum in here. Who even keeps stuff like this anymore?" May said nothing. She simply ran her fingers along the edge of Robert's old chair and watched them drift through the room as though they were tourists passing through an exhibit that bored them. Candace intercepted most of the comments with professional ease, steering conversations toward the solid structure of the house and its location, its unique character. But May heard every careless word, felt each one settle like a small stone in her chest. Outside, between waves of visitors, May stepped briefly onto the porch to breathe. Across the street, her neighbors watched unabashedly now. A few smiled politely, but others smirked, whispering to one another. She could almost hear them. "She's finally selling it. Wonder how fast it'll get bulldozed." Candace came out beside her and placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Don't let it get to you," she said quietly. "People don't always see what's in front of them, but trust me, the right buyer will." May nodded, though she didn't answer. She looked out at the street she had walked every day for 70 years, at the trees that had been saplings when she first moved here and were now tall enough to shade entire lawns. She remembered her children riding bikes down this very road, Robert waving to her from the porch as he came home from work. All of it existed here, layered in her memory like transparent sheets of the past laid over the present. To hear strangers dismiss it so easily cut deeper than she cared to admit. The second half of the afternoon brought a different crowd. An older couple wandered through the room slowly, their hands intertwined, pausing often to look closely at the photographs on the mantel and the shelves in the library. May noticed the way the woman's fingers lingered on the spines of certain books, how she smiled faintly at the floral patterns in the guest bedroom. "This reminds me of my mother's house," the woman said softly to her husband. "Everything is so well kept. Look at this sewing kit. Exactly like hers." For the first time that day, May felt her chest lighten a little. Here was someone who saw not just the structure, but the care that had been poured into it. The couple spoke gently to her, asking small questions about the house's history, and May found herself answering in quiet detail. When the kitchen was remodeled, how Robert had built the bookshelves himself, how the oak tree out back had been planted the year their first child was born. But for every such moment, there were others that reminded her how quickly the world moved on. One group of younger visitors walked through the room snapping photos on their phones, laughing among themselves about vintage vibes and grandma aesthetics. In the basement, one man remarked loudly that it would make a great space for a home gym once we rip all this out. By evening, when the last of the visitors finally left and Candace closed the door behind them, the house felt strangely hollow, as though the constant flow of footsteps and voices had disturbed its stillness in a way that could not be undone. May stood in the living room, gazing at the photographs on the mantel, listening to the silence slowly settle back over the rooms. Candace approached her with a reassuring smile. "It went well," she said. "We had a lot of interest, and I'm confident we'll get offers. But, more importantly, I think people are beginning to see what I saw when I first walked in, that this is something special." May didn't answer right away. She walked slowly to the library where the evening sun slanted through the curtains and lit up the rows of books like burnished gold. She sat in Robert's old chair, running her fingers over the worn leather armrest. For a long time, she simply sat there, letting the quiet envelop her again. Yes, people had laughed. They had dismissed it as old, out of touch, ready for demolition. But not all of them. A few had looked closer, That was enough to remind her why she had loved this house for so long. It was not for everyone. It was not supposed to be. It held stories, and not everyone cared about stories anymore. But someone would. Outside, the street was quiet now. The neighbors had gone inside, their lights glowing in tidy rows across the way. May closed her eyes and listened to the faint creak of the wood as the house settled around her. Whatever came next, she thought, this place would endure a little longer, not just as lumber and nails, but as the keeper of a history she was not ready to see forgotten. The house was quiet the morning after the first open showing. May rose as she always did, moving slowly through her familiar routines, but something felt different. She could still hear the echoes of footsteps from the day before, the whispers and laughter of strangers who had walked through rooms that had once been private sanctuaries. Even after they had gone, it seemed the air in the house still carried their presence, as if their curiosity had unsettled the peace that had lived there for decades. Candace arrived late in the morning, brisk and energetic as always, though her voice carried a note of anticipation. "I've scheduled another showing today," she explained, flipping open her planner as though it were a weapon against uncertainty. "Smaller group this time, 3 parties, all seriously interested. I think this could be it, Mrs. Ellison. We might have our buyer before the week is out." May smiled faintly at her optimism, though she herself felt less certain. "We'll see," she said. She wanted to believe it, but the memory of mocking voices still lingered too vividly. She wasn't sure she wanted someone to buy her home who saw it only as a project to strip bare and rebuild. Yet she held her tongue. The decision had been made, and she would see it through. By noon, the visitors began to arrive. Among them was a quiet man in his late 40s, a history teacher from one of the local high schools, accompanied by his teenage daughter. There was also a young woman, slender and sharp-eyed, who introduced herself as a writer for a local magazine. Finally came a well-dressed couple in their 60s who had already toured the house once and had returned with more questions. May observed them from her usual place, standing near the doorway of the library while Candace led them through the home. The older couple moved slowly and respectfully, pausing to admire the details. The teacher seemed deeply engaged, pointing things out to his daughter, the carved edges of the staircase banister, the old sewing machine in the corner of the guest bedroom. But it was the writer who lingered the longest in the library. She drifted towards the shelves of books, her fingers gliding over their spines as though tracing the past. Then she crouched near one of the lower shelves, where several old boxes sat tucked neatly against the wall. "Are these yours?" she asked softly. May hesitated. "Yes," she said. "Robert kept them all his life. Newspapers, letters, things he thought mattered." The writer tilted her head, her interest sharpening. "Would you mind if I looked?" Candace glanced at May as if to ensure it was all right. May gave a small nod. "Go on," she said, though she couldn't imagine what there was to see. She had lived with those boxes for decades, their contents long familiar to her, Robert's careful collection of clippings from the local paper, flyers from rallies they had attended in the 60s, handwritten notes exchanged with neighbors when telephones were scarce. The writer lifted one box onto the low table and gently opened it. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes and folded newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. She sifted through them carefully, her brow furrowing as she read. "These," she murmured, almost to herself. "These are original prints from the marches in Selma. Look, there's King here, giving his speech in Montgomery." She glanced up suddenly, excitement sparking in her eyes. "Mrs. Ellison, did you know what you have here?" May blinked, caught off guard. "I know what's in those boxes," she replied evenly. "My husband kept them because he thought one day they might matter. We were there, you know. We marched to—" The room went very still. Even Candace, who had been poised with her clipboard, paused mid-note and turned toward May in surprise. "You were there?" the history teacher asked, his voice low but reverent. May nodded. "Robert and I, back in the spring of '65, we joined a bus from our church, walked the same road as the rest. We didn't make it all the way to Montgomery. He had to get back to work. But we marched that first day, and this house—" her voice softened, her gaze distant. "This house was where folks came to meet before those rallies. There were nights when every chair, every inch of floor was filled with people. They talked plans, wrote letters, prayed together. We kept the blinds shut and the lights low, but they came here because they trusted us." The writer's pen was already scratching furiously across her notebook. "You mean this house was a meeting place during the civil rights movement?" May shrugged modestly, though there was pride behind her eyes. "That's what it was then. Just neighbors helping neighbors. Robert believed in keeping records of it all. He said one day people might forget, and someone ought to remember." The teacher stepped closer, his daughter wide-eyed beside him. "Mrs. Ellison," he said gently, "this isn't just a house. This is history." Candace looked from May to the open boxes and back again, her expression one of dawning realization. She had admired the home before, but now she saw it through an entirely different lens. The wood-paneled basement, once just a charming relic, became something more, a hidden place where whispered plans had been made. The library's shelves, stacked high with carefully preserved documents, became an archive of lived experience. As word spread through the small group, their energy shifted. The writer asked to take photographs, promising to include the story in her next feature. The teacher spoke eagerly of bringing his students to see the place if it became accessible to the public. Even the older couple, who had been quietly considering a bid, now seemed hesitant, as though unsure whether this house should even be sold in the usual way. That afternoon, after they left, Candace lingered behind. She paced slowly through the library, glancing at the shelves and boxes, then turned to May with a look of awe. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, "do you understand what this could mean? If people knew what this house represents, its role in the movement, this isn't just real estate anymore. It's heritage." May smiled faintly, lowering herself into Robert's old chair. "It's always been heritage to me," she said simply. Within 2 days, the story appeared in the local paper, accompanied by photographs of May's library and interviews with her about those nights decades ago when the house had been alive with voices of change. What had begun as a routine listing became something else entirely. Reporters called for interviews. Neighbors who had once mocked the house now stopped by with hesitant smiles and awkward apologies, offering compliments they'd never voiced before. Even the children who once dared each other to run past and shout names now stood quietly on the sidewalk, staring at the house with newfound curiosity. Their parents spoke to May differently now, too, with words like important and historic, replacing the dismissive tones they once used. It was as if the very air around the place had changed, and May, though humbled by the sudden attention, felt something lift in her chest. For the first time in years, people weren't just looking at her house, they were seeing it. Late that evening, long after the last visitor had gone and the house had returned to its stillness, May sat alone in the library, her hand resting lightly on one of the old boxes. She traced Robert's handwriting on the labels, neat and steady as it had always been. "You were right," she whispered into the quiet. "You said they'd matter one day." She imagined him there beside her, smiling in that quiet, knowing way he had. Outside, a warm wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree, and the house seemed to sigh contentedly around her. Whatever happened next, she knew now that she would not simply be selling a home. She would be passing on a story, one too powerful to be forgotten. In the days that followed the article's publication, May's quiet street transformed in ways she had never imagined. What had once been a place where only her neighbors' curious or mocking glances fell upon her home now saw a steady trickle of visitors, students clutching notebooks, journalists carrying cameras, even city officials in suits walking up her path as though it were no longer just an ordinary house, but something to be studied and preserved. May watched it all with a mixture of pride and disbelief. For decades, her home had stood silently while the world outside changed, ignored by those who passed it daily. Now, suddenly, it was alive again. The first sign of what was to come arrived one warm afternoon when a woman from the city's historical commission knocked on May's door. She introduced herself politely and explained that, after reviewing the story in the paper and speaking to Candace, they wished to have the house formally evaluated for historical significance. May listened quietly, nodding at the words she understood and allowing the rest to wash over her. The official spoke of applications, inspections, committees. All of it felt far removed from the life she had led here, but she recognized that something important was happening. Over the next week, the library became the focal point of their attention. Archivists arrived with white gloves and gentle hands, carefully lifting the fragile letters and clippings from their boxes. They murmured over the dates, the signatures, the names of places and people now etched into history books but here connected by ink to her husband's steady hand. One woman found a photograph May had almost forgotten, a black and white snapshot of her front porch, crowded with neighbors on a summer night, papers spread across the table as they planned for the march to Atlanta. May stared at it for a long time, seeing her younger self smiling faintly in the corner, Robert beside her with his arm around her shoulder. The visits grew more frequent. News crews came to film segments that aired on the evening broadcast, showing her house bathed in golden sunlight, while May herself spoke briefly on camera about those years and the gatherings they had hosted. She kept her words simple, not embellishing the truth, but viewers seemed captivated all the same. Children at the local school sent her letters written in careful handwriting, thanking her for helping make history real. One even drew a picture of her house, its crooked fence and towering oak tree rendered with bright crayons and an earnestness that made her smile. Her neighbors, too, began to treat her differently. The same people who once rolled their eyes at her old wreck of a house now stopped by to shake her hand, to say things like, "We had no idea," and "It's an honor to live near you." The shift felt strange, but not unwelcome. One evening, the man who had so often complained about her house being an eyesore brought over a basket of fresh peaches as a peace offering, stammering through an apology that May accepted graciously, if quietly amused. The culmination of it all came one bright morning when Candace arrived with 2 city officials and a stack of papers. May sat at her kitchen table while they explained that her house was to be formally recognized as a historic landmark. It would not be torn down or gutted, but preserved. The city planned to partner with a local cultural foundation to transform it into a small museum dedicated to the community's role in the civil rights movement. May would be able to live out her remaining time in comfort elsewhere, while knowing the home she and Robert had built would endure far beyond her. She listened in silence, her hands folded on the table. When they finished speaking, she looked around the kitchen, at the sunlight streaming across the counters Robert had installed, at the old copper pot resting on the stove, at the tiny cracks in the tiles she had scrubbed countless times. Her heart ached, but it was not the sharp pain of loss. It was something gentler, a bittersweet recognition of an ending that felt right. "I'll agree," she said softly, "on one condition. Part of whatever comes from this must go back to the people here. Programs for the seniors, the schools. I want it to help." They exchanged surprised glances, but then nodded. "We can arrange that," one of them replied warmly. The following weeks passed in a blur. Volunteers helped her pack her belongings, each item carefully wrapped and labeled. The furniture would remain, part of the preservation, but her personal keepsakes, photographs, letters, Robert's medals, would come with her. She found herself wandering the rooms late at night, running her fingers over familiar surfaces one last time. In the dining room, she paused beside the table where her family had shared decades of meals. In the living room, she sat on the sofa where she had cradled her newborn daughter. In the library, she lingered longest, holding Robert's chair and closing her eyes to imagine his voice once more. The day of the official dedication arrived under a sky so blue it seemed almost painted. A small crowd gathered in front of her house. City officials, neighbors, school children holding paper flags. Reporters stood ready with microphones, and a podium was set up near the porch. Candace stood beside May, smiling with pride, while the mayor spoke about the extraordinary significance of this home and the enduring courage of those who came together here. May listened quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She saw faces she had known for years and many she had never seen before. When they finally handed her the microphone, she hesitated, unaccustomed to speaking in front of so many, but the hush that fell over them gave her courage. "This house," she began slowly, "was never meant to be anything special. Robert and I built our life here because it was ours. We raised our children here. We laughed here, prayed here, mourned here. And yes, there were nights when this house became more than a home. It became a place where hope lived, even when the world outside felt dark. We didn't think of ourselves as part of history. We were just neighbors, doing what we could." She paused, her voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. "I'm grateful it will be remembered. Not for me, but for what it stood for." Applause rippled through the crowd, warm and unforced. In the days that followed, workers began the delicate task of transforming the house into a museum while maintaining its essence. They reinforced the structure, refreshed the exterior paint in its original color, and trimmed the ivy while leaving the crooked fence exactly as it was. Inside, the library was carefully arranged into a permanent exhibit, the old boxes of letters and photographs displayed under protective glass. The basement bar, once a relic of another era, was restored to its former shine, complete with a plaque explaining its use as a gathering space for neighborhood meetings. May moved quietly into a nearby retirement community that overlooked a small garden, where she could see flowers blooming from her window each morning. It was not her old home, but it was comfortable and peaceful. On her first night there, she unpacked Robert's photograph and set it on the table beside her bed. Sitting in her new chair, she watched the sunset paint the sky and whispered, "We did it, Robert. It's safe now." Weeks later, she watched a news segment on television showing the first school group visiting the newly opened museum. Children wandered through her rooms with wide eyes, listening to a guide speak about the house's history, about the people who had gathered there when courage was needed most. She saw one child point to a photograph of her and Robert on the porch, and her chest tightened with a tender ache. May smiled faintly, her hands folded in her lap. The house was no longer hers, but it was no longer mocked either. It was alive again, filled with voices, footsteps, and wonder, just as it had been all those years ago. Her story and Robert's would outlive them both. As night settled in, she closed her eyes and listened to the distant hum of cicadas outside her window. For the first time in a long time, she felt entirely at peace. Her home was no longer simply a house on an old street. It had become a legacy, one that would stand long after she was gone, a testament to the quiet strength of ordinary lives woven into the fabric of history. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more, and share this one with your friends and family.